Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henry McCann. I'm a research associate with the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us today. For today's program, I'm going to share a short presentation on the pace and scale of improving forest health and key takeaways for looking ahead. The blog posts that we draw on in this discussion today, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are all available on our website at ppic.org. I also want to acknowledge my research collaborator, Mingfei Zhang, who recently finished his master's in forestry from Duke and now works on forest carbon credits at Blue Source. We'd like to thank the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation for support of today's virtual event. After my presentation, we will turn to our panelists to provide a forward-looking perspective on what state and federal agencies are doing to boost efforts to improve forest health. And finally, we'll conclude our event with audience questions. If you have a question for our panelists, please send an email to the address on the screen, which is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. That is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd also appreciate if you include your name and your organization along with your question. And with that, I will begin my presentation. It is both a daunting and remarkable time to be engaged in headwater forest management issues. On one hand, the state has recently experienced some of the largest and most devastating wildfires in state history. On the other, enthusiasm in local, state, and federal policy discussions for improving forest health is rapidly growing. However, as policymakers and forest managers make plans to accelerate the pace and scale of work and direct additional public funding to this purpose, improving our overall understanding of past management activities is essential. We set out to use available data sets to do some basic accounting of management efforts in the Headwater region over the last decade. Filling this gap in understanding provides a clear picture of the scale and scope of what's needed to bring forests back to health. It can also help set priorities for allocating scarce management resources. The Sierra Cascade Headwater forests are 5.5 million acres of mixed conifer forest located on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada and Southern Cascade ranges, roughly between 2,000 and 6,000 feet in elevation. The map on the left marks this area in gold. These forests are indicated in green. 2/3 of these forests are federally owned, which is indicated by the dark green color. The remainder are private and other non-federal public forest lands. This region is critically important to the state's water grid, as half of the state's surface water supplies originate in these mountains. The region has very high wildfire risk and vulnerability to droughts and pests. It's also important to point out at this point that the management techniques and benefits of those techniques that I'm going to talk about in this research are really specific to this region, and that they'll be different in other climates and vegetation types found in other parts of the state. California's headwater forests have become more dense and simplified compared to their pre-European conditions. This change was in large part driven by the prohibition of frequent burning by indigenous communities, early timber harvest practices, and aggressive fire suppression. And we're living with the consequences of these changes today in terms of more large, severe wildfires and increasing susceptibility to widespread tree die-off due to drought and beetle attacks. The overall goal of managing these forests today is to create variation in terms of tree densities, openings, and tree sizes, which can improve overall forest health. Pictured here is an example of where forest managers have created this structure today in the Stanislaus Tuolumne experimental forest. According to forest management research, this approach must be vastly expanded in pace and scale in order to meaningfully improve forest health. The management techniques that can do this fit into two broad categories: strategic use of fire on one hand and mechanical treatments on the other. Strategic use of fire is the intentional setting of controlled fires, which we describe as prescribed burning, or the management of natural ignitions, for example, from lightning strikes, for resource benefits. We call this managed wildfire. As a research note, it was very difficult to obtain accurate data on the use of managed wildfire on private and federal lands, so we excluded it from our accounting. Mechanical treatments, on the other hand, refer to the use of mechanized equipment to remove live and dead fuels from forests. This includes both mechanical thinning and timber harvest. With timber harvest, the goal is harvesting logs for commercial purposes. But depending on how the technique is applied and the setting that it's applied in, it can also contribute to improving forest resilience to wildfire and drought. The next slides provide some high-level takeaways from our accounting on how these techniques have been used in the Headwater region. I want to first provide a quick overview of our approach to accounting. We work to assemble data on how timber harvest, mechanical treatment, and prescribed burning have been used in the period of 2010 to 2020 in this region. We focused on calculating the footprint of management, which is the number of acres that were managed at least once during this period. Per our approach, multiple management activities occurring on the same acre of forest during this period are counted as 1 acre of management. The high-level takeaway from our accounting work is that forest management is not scaling up fast enough to meet forest health goals. Experts suggest that reducing the spread of severe wildfire requires strategically treating and maintaining approximately 20 to 30% of forests in the landscape. By our accounting, forest managers have treated around 16% of forests overall over the past decade. But this overall trend masks some notable differences. For example, management on private forests is almost 3 times the rate of management on federal forests. Also, there are differences across the region, as this map illustrates. Only 8 in 24 watersheds have reached or exceeded this management target. This figure illustrates how different management techniques were used to accomplish a total of 912,000 acres of treatment over the past decade. We were really surprised to find that timber harvest, which tends to play a more marginal role in the policy discussion on improving forest health, represents more than 2/3 of the total acres that were managed over the last decade. We found that timber harvest was more prevalent in the northern watersheds, where private forest ownership is more common. This finding underscores the need to explore how timber harvest fits into the larger picture of improving forest health. We also found stark differences in forest management approach depending on ownership type. Federal agencies, in this case mostly the United States Forest Service, accomplished just over 400,000 acres of treatment over the last decade, and did so with a diverse portfolio of techniques. For example, less than half of these acres were managed for timber harvest. By contrast, almost 90% of the 500,000 acres treated on private lands were managed for timber harvest, and to a much smaller extent, mechanical treatments and prescribed burning. In absolute terms, the U.S. Forest Service carried out 3 times more non-timber treatments compared to private landowners. We built a time series with our data illustrating the cumulative growth in the footprint of management over the decade. It suggests that the pace of management has been rather steady at around 90,000 acres per year. This reflects the fact that state and federal funding sources were largely stagnant over this period. The share of non-timber treatments increased slightly, but we were expecting to see a clear acceleration of the rate of treatment in more recent years due to the increase in state funding for improving forest health. It's possible that the pace will pick up once new state funds reach the ground, and this will be important to track over time to evaluate how state funds are being deployed. As a final thought from our accounting work, differences in pace and type of management raise 2 key challenges looking forward. The first is that the U.S. Forest Service and other federal agencies own 2/3 of headwater forests, but have treated only 11% over the past decade, suggesting that more is needed to increase the pace and scale of work on these forest lands in particular to reach treatment objectives of 20 to 30%. The other is that private forest managers are largely meeting the treatment goal, By our accounting, private landowners treated around 28% of their forests, and most of it is in the form of timber harvest. This once again highlights the critical need to better understand how timber harvest integrates into forest health goals, which we hope to weave into our panel discussion. Important pieces of the puzzle are coming together this year, which makes this an ideal moment to set direction on headwater forest management. At the federal level, the U.S. Forest Service recently formalized their commitment to ramping up management efforts in a collaborative way. This is a really important step for catalyzing cross-boundary forest management work and pooling resources so that they increase capacity where it is most needed. There are also talks of linking federal economic recovery dollars to forest management work, which was done during the Great Recession. The state also committed to increasing their forest management work in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. And a few weeks ago, California's Forest Management Task Force published the state's first action plan for improving forest health on all lands. And complementing this plan is the governor's wildfire resilient spending package as part of the proposed 2021-22 budget. This includes proposals for increasing state funding for forest health and extending the funding timeline on cap and trade dollars that are important to supporting forest health projects. At all levels, improving forest health in California has become a pressing issue. We hope that our accounting work and the conversation today leads to continued momentum in this area and progress towards forest health objectives. With that, I'll say thank you. And as a reminder to all, please submit your questions for the panel or for myself by sending them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And as a reminder also, please include your name and your organization along with your question. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jeffrey Mount, who's a senior fellow at the PPIC Water Policy Center. Jeff will be moderating the panel discussion today. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Henry, and good morning to everyone. I want to be sure and make a reminder that you can get at this information on our website, and you can also download the data that Henry and his colleague have assembled. It's actually really an interesting data set. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and then we're going to have a free-ranging discussion. Again, I want to remind you what Henry showed you. Send us your questions, and I'll try and squeeze them in the last 15 minutes of this presentation. But let me start by introducing the people who we've got today, and it's many of them known to you, well known to all of you. First on our list is Angela Avery, who's the executive officer at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. Angela is right in the thick of one of the most interesting projects going on in the Sierras, and I'll ask her some questions about it. Our second is Chris Fischer, who's the Deputy Director of the U.S. Forest Service Region 5. Obviously, Henry's work has singled out the Forest Service as being absolutely critical to this. And then the last that I'll be introducing here is a friend of mine who I've known well for many years, and that's Keith Gilless, who's chair of the California Board of Forestry, but known well to you also from his time as dean at Berkeley, and one of the leading thinkers on forestry economics. So this is, as I say, this is a wonderful all-star cast. If you want to know more about them and their bios, go to our website. We've got that all set up for you to review there. So I thought I would kick it off with you, Keith, because this goes right to kind of a central issue that comes out, and I will profess profound ignorance about this, and you're gonna illuminate us, but I want to lean on both your professional experiences in forestry as well as your role of being the head of the Board of Forestry at the same time. Henry's results were really interesting, which showed that on private land in the headwater forests, they're doing aggressive treatment if we include logging in the overall consideration of treatment. Well, that's fine, and it actually makes sense since these are private lands and they're trying to earn money off these lands. But how does that fit into this overall concept of improving forest health and treatments in the headwaters, and both from the point of view of the Board of Forestry, as well as the point of view from Keith in all of this? So if you could sort of explain that to us, it would really help.
Yeah, so I've got 2 hours prepared on this, Jeff.
No.
First, just let me say that I think I'm not out of line by saying that the general attitude of the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is that most of California's forests need more management rather than less. And that may be a transition strategy in some instances to get us to a point where some things like very regular use of prescribed fire could change the dynamic of the woods. But I think that increased management, and in particular commercial harvesting, is absolutely essential if we're going to reach any of our goals. And I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. The imbalance, if you would, between the use or reliance of harvesting on private and especially industrial lands in this area relative to the public forests in part reflects the right sizing of the capacity to process material on the woods. That California has seen a long enough period of downsizing in Forest Service harvesting activity that the processing capacity is right-sized both in quantity and location to the private resource. So to some extent, our own history has limited the capacity to utilize harvesting as a mechanism to achieve a change in forest structure or to generate revenues to pay for that. So you could, in that sense, say it's an artifact. It's also interesting, though, that if you think about what harvesting activity can do relative to our goals, that we have to be careful not to view harvesting activity as something you partition on either side of the public-private divide in a way that reflects the comparative advantage principles that we sometimes use in things like endangered species management. In this case, the activity needs to take place, if only in a transition period, but quite likely beyond that, much longer.
So Keith, I want to follow up real quickly on that and have you explain it to me. When we look at private lands, timber harvest on private land, I mean, most people, when they drive by, they see what looks like sort of scorched earth clear cutting, and the fact is, how does that fit in to, and I know that it's variable, it's all over the map in terms of the harvest techniques that are used. How does that fit into maintaining forest health and reducing wildfire? I mean, is suddenly the wildfire threat gone once you've logged that land, or what happens over the next 5 years? I want to dig into your expertise on this and see if you can explain this well, so that.
Well, yeah, and certainly it is not accurate to characterize harvesting as meaning clear cutting. That in fact, the activity on the board during the decade I've been on it for non-industrial lands has largely been revolving around encouraging sustainable forestry that's directed towards uneven age management or sort of light touch forestry, but with an eye towards light touch forestry that can generate enough revenue to get the management activity on the ground that will improve overall forest structure and resilience. I don't think, especially when I talk about what kind of harvesting activity would take place on the public side of that public-private boundary, that we're talking about clear cutting. And you know, there's a legacy there that is part of the public debate, which doesn't serve us well in getting at the nuanced solutions based on the science we know now. I certainly, when I was a Forest Service employee in Idaho back in the 70s, worked in clear cuts that even on the science at the time, I don't think should have been the size they were. But if we're trying to maintain that rich species diversity of a mixed conifer region, there are instances where at a small scale, you're doing small group selection, which give you the conditions to maintain that species diversity and avoid kind of a monoculture of white fir that we really want to encourage. And so I think we have to get out of characterizing active forest harvesting as meaning the legacy of what I would characterize as mismanagement that was going on in the 60s and even into the 70s. But let me just say one thing on that. At the current time, I think a bigger problem in this region is the fact that our fire situation has resulted in such large and high intensity fires that we're in danger not of creating really a very different and unsuitable landscape through type conversion from harvesting, but in fact from the fire experience that we have to change our management to get out of a cycle that is in some instances a bit self-perpetuating and very much not in the interests of the land or California society.
Thanks, Keith. It's important to get at this. This is PPIC. We do nuance for a living. I mean, and that's what we focus on. Let me switch over to Chris here in a second. So, Chris, you're the guy in the partnership world because you've got massive amounts of acreage to manage, and I really focused on Henry's results there, and not really surprising, I suspect, to you, is when you look at the pace of treatment on federal land, and the Forest Service is committed to doubling this rate. And there's a part of me when I look at that, and the first thing I ask is how. I mean, money does not necessarily solve the problem, although there was the allusion to the fact that money was a constraint. It almost always is some kind of a constraint. What is the Forest Service going to have to do? What's going to happen in order to get to that, especially on federal land?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for that question. And money, of course, always helps. But you're right, that isn't the end all. And really, what we see as helping us to commit to increasing our pace and scale is through greater partnerships in the state. The Forest Service we've been working in partnerships for decades, but not at the scale of a statewide kind of initiative or strategy. And that's why we're really excited about our recent signing of the shared stewardship MOU with the Natural Resources Agency and CAL FIRE that we signed last August. This really is going to set a tone for not only California, all of its citizens and its forest land, for really having a joint framework to enhance our stewardship and land management activities on California's forest lands. And just real briefly, I just wanted to talk about some of the kind of the elements and principles of that shared stewardship plan. Many on this broadcast may have seen it, but I think it's important to just touch on them real briefly. It has three core elements, meaning one being to manage together, doing the right work in the right places at the right scale, and for using all available tools for better land management and stewardship. It has 6 principles to utilize science, prioritize community safety and ecology, improve our efficiencies, scale up forestry across all sectors, coordinate land management, and collaborate and innovate with all stakeholders. And that leads into really the actions that were defined in this MOU. One, Jeff, like you mentioned, is, CAL FIRE as well as the Forest Service have committed to increasing our pace and scale to 500,000 acres per year by 2025. So that will be 1 million acres per year by that year. And you saw in one of the slides earlier, excuse me, is that, we treated 900 something thousand the past decade. So we got a heavy lift here. But we really see that this MOU and the partnerships that we're going to be establishing is going to help that. With that, another action is to develop a 20-year joint stewardship plan. And this is really key to getting to increasing the pace and scale. And this isn't a plan between just the MOU signatories. This is a plan with all interested parties in California that want to aid in helping us with doing land management, land stewardship of our forested areas. Number 4, using sustainable veg treatments that Keith just touched on, expanding forest management and associated infrastructure. Key component. We're not gonna mechanically treat or burn ourselves out of this issue. We also have to make sure that we're supporting and looking at ways to increase our infrastructure opportunities. Wood processing facilities, clean energy, bioenergy plants, etc. Promoting ecological co-benefits. Number 6, developing markets for wood products and recycled forest byproducts. 7 is improving access to sustainable recreation. 8, fire adapted communities. And 9, to advance the science and shared monitoring and data analytics. And you will see, if you haven't reviewed the action plan that the state has recently put out, a lot of those actions are described in there. And we're excited to be partnering with the state and the Forest Management Task Force to begin to implement these actions right now. I mean, time is of the essence. We cannot wait any longer. We want to, incite action. And so with that, that's my initial response to that, Jeff. Thank you.
So thanks, Chris. I mean, I think you've understated it's a heavy lift. I listen to the complexity of that, and I'm impressed. So so's your dog. So
sorry about that.
No, don't be sorry about it. Mine are currently in the backyard. But real quickly, a real quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
Every complex problem has what is by far the most limiting factor in it. Usually when you tear it apart, there's a bottleneck somewhere. What do you think is the biggest bottleneck to that list of things that you want to do that are part of the new partnership?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. I think it's, it's acting, saying we're going to develop partnerships and work in partnerships is a really great thing. But we all have different missions. We all have different visions. We all have different ideas on what forest management should look like out on the ground. And I think a bottleneck is we sometimes get stuck on what our differences are. And I think we need to start focusing on what our similarities are so that we can really start moving forward on those similarities and continue our discussion and dialogue on our differences. California is a big state. We got 40 million people. Oftentimes I feel like there's 40 million opinions in forest management in California. Maybe not that many, but there's a lot. And so I think we just, so we need to continue to have dialogue around our differences. And then we need to overcome those differences to be able to implement land management across landscape scales. We got to get out of the small project level, and we really got to start talking about landscape scales, sort of like the work that Angela is doing.
Well, that's a perfect segue. And now the dog has been put outside, I see. So, okay, Angie, let me come to you. In many ways, I mean, you've got a kind of like a fan club, and you're working on one of the most interesting projects in the Sierras, at least in I think in my lifetime, in terms of seeing what's going on in the Sierras. And this, of course, the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, that none of us can actually remember that. It's so special. And you're doing this with lots of partners. There's lots of partnerships. It's actually going at it's got meaningful scale. I mean, this is the theme of today, is getting to scale. And it's an impressive effort when you look at it on the surface. So what I thought I would give you a chance to do is I mean, and Chris and Keith are both very well aware of this project and its significance, but it is kind of, it's breaking trail here for what could be a lot of other projects. So I want to start by asking you, well, first, what's working? I mean, what are you most proud of in terms of the way this is working, or at least satisfied with the way it's working? And what needs more work out of this? And I'll make sure you get to that second part, because I think this is where you learn more from what's not working than what is working. So let's start with what's working, what needs more work.
Absolutely. let me start though before by saying that we're perfectly willing to test Chris's assumption that money doesn't solve everything. Happy to engage and test that assumption. So no, we are really proud of what's happening on the TCSI landscape. You know, from the ground level activity perspective, we've got a handful of large landscape scale projects that have received significant investment. One of them is working across 275,000 acres. One of them is working across 28,000 acres or so. Each of those landscape scale projects is testing new innovations in the way you think about how you actually obtain additional investment to achieve the goals of the project and to increase the pace and scale of work on the ground. The French Meadows, that's the North Yuba project that I'm talking about there. And the French Meadows project is really looking at ways to sort of get to the work that needs to happen more quickly by trying to figure out and explore options for improving environmental planning and survey work and basically creating efficiencies by working at that larger scale. But I think that what we're doing on TCSI is game changing with a couple of the central tenets of how we're working across that large landscape. Knowing what we're trying to do gets to some of the issues that Chris was mentioning around sort of the partnerships. And I'll talk about sort of the resilience framework in just a second. Working at the regional scale allows us to actually see the efficiencies, create efficiencies, and sort of build on the partnerships that exist in a regional scale. And then really thinking about a forest restoration economy from that perspective, where you really are doing work on the ground. It gets to the timber harvest question, I think that Keith was talking about a little bit, that if you can use commercial thinning in such a way that you can sort of reinvest that funding into the work that needs to happen on the ground, there's some, again, economies of scale and benefits that come with that. So doing a little bit of a deeper dive into the tenet of coming to agreement on how you work, we believe that driving towards resilience on a landscape is really critical, right? It's a critical way for us to work. And we spent a few years at the beginning of this project meeting with scientists and land managers and policy people, really trying to uncover kind of what does resilience on a landscape mean? How do you track that? How do you measure progress against it? And then how do you use something like that to build a blueprint that sets out how you work on the landscape in a way that you can sort of think long-term into the future, not only increasing pace and scale, but driving the investment that you need to do that work. So the first thing that came out of the TCSI work was a resilience framework. And it's a two-piece sort of thing. The first is a portfolio of conditions for evaluating socio-ecological resilience, right? Because we can't just think about the landscape separate from the people that live and work in those landscapes. And we've got those documents finalized. We're getting very close to releasing them. And I actually am really interested to see people's reactions to those 10 pillars, because they are, like I said, they're social. They think about how people live and work in the landscape and the benefits of doing sort of the ecological work on the landscape that comes to the people. So the 10 pillars of resilience, as we refer to them, include everything from, forest structure and biodiversity to, thinking about community benefits, including things like, water security and air quality and so forth and so on. The second piece of the framework starts to get to assessing current conditions, looking at what future conditions look like, and then figuring out a pathway to achieve those future conditions, again, all built in the resilience pillars and metrics that are associated with those pillars. So that's the first piece that we think is really important when you have partnerships that are cross-sector, and to Chris's point, you have people in the room who have different goals and missions. Having a common framework of understanding for what you're trying to achieve on the landscape really helps collaboratives and groups working in a region move towards that, setting goals and thinking about how you're actually going to implement on the landscape. So we think that's key. The regional approach, we also think that's another really important element because, big picture solutions may be very similar, but when you think about forest management activities actually on the landscape, a resilient forest structure looks very different in Lassen County than it does in Madera County. So we built the TCSI it's about a 2.4 million acre landscape, and we think about it from the regional perspective. It goes beyond individual project work, beyond collaborative work to sort of, this regional scale of, it doesn't even have to be organized, but a bunch of different activities that sort of have regional benefit to the conditions on a landscape that are, that exist, right, in that particular local area. So we do think that the 1 to 3 million acre region is a way to organize and a way to plan that could be valuable to increasing the pace and scale of ecological restoration. And then finally, once you have agreement on what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve on the landscape, and you've got sort of an organization of cross-sector partners who are in alignment on where you're going, you can then start to think from the restoration economy perspective, right? So you're managing the landscape. There's woody biomass that needs to come off the landscape. You need something to do with it. You need to be able to do something with that. So you need to be thinking about how to invest in increased infrastructure, how projects start to pay for themselves. Are you creating jobs that support the whole of all of those activities on a landscape? So that's another piece of what we're doing. TNC actually has a really good report out right now that they worked with Bain and Company that talks about all of the policy opportunities and the values and benefits of doing sort of the restoration economy kind of holistic perspective. So we really think that the combination of these innovative ideas, though they're not new, pulling them all together as a sort of a cohesive format for moving forward has real value in trying to achieve, again, from our perspective, resilience is the goal, right? We don't want to recreate the gold rush on our forests. We want to act where it's appropriate and act in places where there's agreement and act at scales where you can measure and track progress and see difference on the landscape, and then do that in a way where you're also benefiting the people who live and work in the region.
So to follow, since I tortured Chris with this question, I think it's fair to torture you. I mean, this is a very complex, big, elaborate undertaking on your part. And there are bottlenecks that you are going to be worried about. And so at the top of the list, what's the bottleneck for you? And you can't just say money.
No, I won't just say money. So one of the things that I think is a bottleneck, and this comes to me because the Sierra Nevada Conservancy is in the process right now of looking at the lessons that we're learning from the TCSI landscape and trying to understand the role we might play and what the impediments are to scaling that out across our 25 million acre region. And so one of the core things that I think is a bottleneck is that we as a state, as a nation, as individuals, don't have shared agreement about what resilience looks like on the landscape. We don't have agreement about how you get to resilience, what tools or processes you use. And that's why we think the pillars that are foundational to TCSI, though they would not be in exactly the same weights and measures applied across other regions, we do think they could be foundational to starting that conversation or to supporting the existing conversations that are already happening at the local level. So we feel like that we're missing that forest health framework, that sort of definition, shared understanding of what resilience is at a regional scale across this area.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left for this part before we go to Q&A, and I'm getting some interesting questions already starting to appear on my screen. How did we do all this without Zoom? We actually talked to each other in the same room. I want to do kind of the equivalent of a lightning round with the three of you. And I'm going to start with Angie first. We were doing one of our dog and pony shows at PPIC years ago, and I said, I'm the policy fairy, and I can change something for you. And of course, that appeared on my wall in my office after that. So if we could change one thing, Angie, if that would facilitate this, and this could be federal legislation, state legislation, or just behavior, I don't care. What would it be? What would be the top of the list for you? One thing.
Can I go back to funding?
Well, I mean, how about how things are funded might be a really important change.
Yeah, so, I need to start that by acknowledging that, and Henry called this out as well. The governor has a proposed $1 billion forest health investment, and that's fantastic. We love it. We hope that the legislature acts on it. We specifically hope that they act on the current year investment so we don't lose 2 years of preventative investment. But what I think that we're missing is sort of the long-term sustained investment that allows us to act at the scale that we need to manage the investments that we're making in first entry, to utilize tools like prescribed fire on the long-term basis. So I don't actually think that's a cop-out answer.
No.
I feel like we need we need to move away from boom and bust funding cycles associated with how we've been acting on the landscape. And I think there are opportunities outside of the governor's proposed budget in the new federal administration that's in place. I think there are opportunities for us to partner through shared stewardship and also to leverage federal funding in a way that could be valuable to our efforts.
Yeah, so I'm in the Water Policy Center. We deal with this all the time, the boom bust cycles and funding. So Chris, back to you on this, and don't worry, you're not speaking for the administration or anything else. You're just speaking for Chris here. When I think about, there was a reason I was asking that bottleneck question, but again, if you could make one fundamental change, and whether this is at the level of the Forest Service or the state or whoever, that would get you there faster, you only get one, what would it be?
Yeah, my response is going to dovetail into what Angela just said. And it goes back to, so last year was the first year of the implementation of the, what we call the wildfire funding fix, right? And so just briefly, for those that aren't aware of this, this came down from Congress that funding for the Forest Service's firefighting efforts was going to be separate from our resource management efforts. Prior, that pot of funds was lumped together. At the end of the year, we would need to pull funds from our management restoration efforts to pay for wildfire funding. So that funding fix was implemented last year, which was very helpful. It's starting to provide some stability in our ability to have funding for restoration efforts. Now, the piece that hasn't been implemented is what I would suggest needs to be implemented. So part of that was to also include funding for Forest Service restoration efforts. And if that could be passed and we could increase funding for our restoration efforts and have that stability, that would help with what Angie was saying. We start to get away from this boom and bust, and we start to have a level of consistency with what we can have for funding for our restoration efforts.
Great.
Since I only get one.
You only get one, sorry, that's it. And there's so many. So Keith, you get to bat cleanup here, and you can do this in the point of view from being on the Board of Forestry. In fact, I would love it if you would sort of give this kind of the state view of that which you would like to see most change to get to this scale problem that Henry identified and we've all discussed today. So
I'll give you a policy answer, Jeff. And we have met the enemy and they are us. It's actually not so much the impediments, but how we view the impediments as justifying sort of a defeatist attitude rather than a bias for action. And I think that we could easily allow the way in which we have operated under the California Environmental Quality Act or the National Environmental Policy Act on either side of that public-private divide as a bright line. Or we could say, let's act on the MOU, which I agree with Chris is one of the avenues that is the most promising for really moving the needle on this, and say, let's find ways that we do not allow that change in the policy environment or the regulatory environment to constrain us. And on my side of the line, on the private lands, that we utilize actions like the programmatic environmental impact report that the board published for vegetation management in order to facilitate our focus on getting the projects done rather than treating each project as if it is more unique than it really in fact is. And in our project level analysis, focus on the things about that project which really matter with respect to our stewardship of the land.
That's perfect, Keith, and that's a great ending. So what I'd like to do is bring Henry back in, and of course you probably all have questions for him, but I want to go to the Q&A here. So if we can bring Henry back in, we do have him back. Welcome back, Henry. And so I have a series of questions, and I'm just gonna pop. The first one that came in was from Simone Albuquerque from Bren School at Santa Barbara. And it's an interesting question because it has not come up at all today, but I know you all deal with it all the time. And this is sort of, how is equity being factored into fuel reduction prioritization in the headwaters? And are Indigenous leaders included in the planning process? So Angie, I think you would be the most logical to answer that. And Keith or Chris, if you want to chime in, but Angie, what are we doing about, how are we handling equity? I know you're talking about the overall economic side, but how broadly how are we handling equity?
It's a really good question. It's a really important question. I think, as SNC partners across our larger 25 million acre region, tribes are important partners to how we do things. But I think that there's a really specific example of how we're sort of thinking about embracing equity and investing in workforce development in a way that brings tribal partners into the game and into the work that needs to be done on the landscape. So for example, there's a project called the Calaveras Healthy Impacts Product Solution. It's designed to spell the word CHIPS. And CHIPS is working with local tribal members to do work on tribal lands, and the work that they're doing is really forest management, forest health work. So that's one opportunity where we know that we have a capacity issue across the landscape as it relates to getting this work done. We need a trained workforce. We need, in addition to funding, we need projects that are in the pipeline and that stay in the pipeline so that when you invest in workforce development, you actually can keep people working in the long term. And so one example of how we're doing that, and I would say in partnership with CAL FIRE, is investing in the CHIPS program. And I think that that's a program that has the ability to expand more broadly. And that's just one idea. Of course, having tribal members and at the table as you're planning projects is critical to project success, and embracing tribal knowledge as you sort of implement prescribed burning and prescribed fire. Those are all ways, but this is one specific example of how we've invested some funding that we've received from CAL FIRE, the CHIPS program.
Thanks, Angie. Keith, do you want to say something?
I just want to say the profession has a lot to overcome here. That when we start at too high a level to define what resilience means and what the landscape we're trying to achieve should look like, it's easy to disregard voices like our tribal community. And I think the forestry profession has a long way to go in figuring out how to incorporate, traditional environmental knowledge into the definition of what resilience is, and in utilizing different elements out of that worldview of what management actions are consistent with achieving those goals. Because process or your tools and your result are intimately linked. They're not separate.
Yeah, okay. It's really good. Whoops, looks like we lost. Oh, Chris is back. Good, because I've got a specific question for Henry, and then I've got a follow-up question directly for Chris. So, Henry, Paul Mason of the Pacific Forest Trust points out that not all timber, and this question I sort of started with Keith, not all timber harvest is alike. In this, and he was wondering whether or not you were able to tease out the difference between different types of logging included in the big timber harvest bucket. And again, this plays right off the question I asked Keith. Were you able to tease that out in your data set?
Thanks for that question, Jeff and Paul. So the answer to that is no, we didn't tease out different timber harvest techniques as being supportive or not supportive of forest health. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the things we were trying to do is compare a timber harvest data set on federal lands to a timber harvest data set on private lands. And there wasn't an exact crosswalk between them. So we figured it's safer to sort of lump them all together at this point, so that we could get to the 2.0 stage of bringing some real ecological and forestry expertise in the room to start teasing those things out. So in the description of the data set that's attached to that blog with all of those results, there's a description of all of the different techniques, timber harvest techniques that were included in there. And I just want to reiterate that, of course, timber harvest, there's a wide range of different ways to do it. And it is worth going in and teasing out the best we can, sort of what each one means. So thank you.
Yeah, okay. Good question. Chris, I have a very specific question for you from Chance Joyce of the American Forest Foundation. Does the U.S. Forest Service have they identified California priority areas? And I'm not sure if that's all I've got in terms of the question. Have you identified California priority areas?
Well, there's probably a couple pieces to that question. So the state of California, with their Forest Action Plan, they developed priority areas for California in terms of how they would see kind of the land treatment across California's landscape. We assisted with that. We work with them on those priority areas. Having said that, we also have priority areas. So, but they do overlap. And in terms of, being strategic about how we manage those lands, I think we have to continue to provide, to do that overlap to make sure, especially with our shared stewardship MOU, that we're kind of managing in tandem with the state and others in our priority areas. I may have misinterpreted that question, but that's kind of what I got now.
But Keith will help us out by following up on that.
I just think that the questions from Paul and from Chance really point to two things. One is the need for us to break out of our traditional boundaries in terms of how we collect data and what data we collect and for what purposes, so that we can actually look at the ecosystem as a whole. And so that's a big lift, and we'll lose something. But Chance's question points out that any prioritization which does not reflect the complexity of the matrix of ownership that is overlaid on this region will inherently be a flawed set of priorities.
Yeah. Yes. And that completely makes sense. Hey, so I've got another question from Vance Russell that I'm going to rephrase, which should be our conservation collective. That I'm going to rephrase so it makes it all four of you, perhaps, can answer. And this forces you to think back 5 years. What has changed most in your thinking about forest management and getting at solving these various wedges that we're talking about? What has changed most for you? What is in the last 5 years of your understanding? Angie, I'll start with you. What's changed most for you? There has to be aha moments in the last 5 years for you. What would those look like?
It's a really good question. I mean, I guess for us is just the urgency of the need to act, right? So that's not necessarily how you act on the ground. It's just the aha moment for us is a little bit terrifying as you look at the scale of fires across the landscape. We look at our area, 43% of the state's elevated or extreme fire risk is in the Sierra Nevada, the region that we serve. That's terrifying. And so sort of it really puts an emphasis for us on the need to act and to act quickly. And we've been, so I don't think that actually gets to the question about how we do work. I mean, I guess if I were to go there, it's prescribed fire, right? Our need to sort of return fire to a landscape that is designed to have fire living on it. But there are steps that has to be taken for that to happen. So those are the two things: the extremity of the current situation and the need to embrace prescribed fire.
So I'm going to jump to Chris on this. Chris, I mean, in the last 5 years, I mean, you've been in this business for a long time. What has changed for you? What in your thinking? What's the aha moment for you?
Boy, you know, it's just the changing landscape. I mean, it seems like every year we say this was our worst fire year ever. You know, last year we burned over 4 million acres, which was just a tremendous amount of wildfire that was put on the ground. And so I think that's been an aha moment. But another aha moment in kind of thinking forward is, you know, when we talk about collaboration and partnerships, we're starting. I think we have a lot more work to do on this piece. And that is, how do we do better in light of uncertainty? Because it just seems like every year something uncertain pops up. And how can we do better at that? You know, as land managers, we like certainty. We want to know exactly what our actions are going to be doing. I think we have to get out of that thinking and be able to take some chances and some risks so that we can move the needle forward in our restoration efforts. That's a really tough one, but I'm starting to see some shifts in that. And I think we're going to have to do more shifting in that in the future. So that's a great question from Vance. Thanks.
Yeah, and those of you who know Vance, it's not a surprise. So I'm going to finish with Henry on this, but Keith, you are, and this is only a compliment, you are the grizzled veteran in all of this for having been in the business longer than anybody on this.
Yeah, I'm old.
Well, I'm the same age, so we know we're both old. This for you, and you can even extend 5 years, but what is the sort of the breakthrough aha moment for you in forest management recent?
Well, it goes to how society deals with natural hazards for me. We tend to react intensely, but our reaction has a very short half-life. And that's from the psychological research that goes across all natural hazards. The last 5 to 10 years have been so extraordinary with respect to our fire experience that we have captured the attention of Californians about the issues of forest management in a way that has never taken place, to my mind, in the past. That has its pluses and minuses because it could create an environment in which we think the whole issue is fire. It's not. And I think if you listen to all of your speakers here, you realize we have so many issues in forestry. Fire has created an opportunity in which we can get public funding that can be matched with private funding in order to accomplish those objectives. So it's what's happened was horrible, but it has created an opportunity to address many issues that go well beyond fire.
Oh, that's a cool answer. So Henry, you get the last laugh here. You got a minute. You're the author of this. I mean, you're the author of multiple reports now, and have been in the trenches. And you're new to the forest world. You're a new friend of the forest, or whatever you want to call it. You're a fiend of the forest. So for you, what's the big aha moment that happened? Either whether it's this study or your recent studies, is sort of understanding of forest. You got 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I did walk into this conversation about 5 years ago, as Jeff pointed out, and you know, even within that sort of short time period, the thing that I've been most sort of encouraged by and pleased to see and be part of is sort of the chorus of actors who are aligning around the issue of forest health and trying to really, so dovetailing off of Keith's response, to really push the needle on this topic in a time when it's most urgent. And this is government actors at all levels. This is the nonprofit, nonprofit organizations and academia. And I'm just really pleased to be part of that chorus. And there's more work to go, but that's my observation. Thanks.
I believe you got to the motto of PPIC: more research is needed. So with that, we've reached the end of our program, and I want to particularly Angie, Keith, and Chris, and Chris's dog. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to help us. That was very entertaining, and I learned a ton, which is always great. Henry, that was a great presentation, and again, I encourage everybody to go take a look at it online if you haven't seen it. And the S.D. Beckel Jr. Foundation, thank you so much for funding this. And finally, thanks to all of you online today who spent your pre-lunch hour with us. So on behalf of PPIC, be safe, please stay safe, and have a good afternoon.